Step into the heart of 1970s Nashville and discover the remarkable story of Gail Davies, the woman who dared to break country music's unwritten rules by producing her own records. In an era when female artists were expected to play by the industry's playbook, she rewrote it entirely, forging a path that future generations would follow. Ready to meet the pioneering spirit behind Nashville's sonic revolution? Born in 1948, Gail Davies came into a world where the very idea of a woman overseeing her own music, producing it, shaping its sound, calling the shots, was almost unthinkable. There were female singers, of course, and many of them soared. But actual production? That was traditionally the realm of men wearing suits and sporting confident smirks at the mixing board. For a female artist to say, "I want to record on my own terms," in 1970s, Nashville was akin to a revolutionary act. Yet that's precisely what Gail Davies did, and in doing so, she challenged not only the constraints placed on her by an industry, but also by a society that was still grappling with the pace of cultural change. To appreciate Gail's journey, you have to step back in time to the era when AM radio dominated the airwaves and country music was shifting from its rural roots to a more polished, pop-influenced sound. This transitional period, especially in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was ripe with opportunity, but also booby-trapped with pitfalls for anyone who tried to break the mold. For most country artists, the roadmap was set in stone. Sign with a label, cut a record using the label's chosen producer, sing the songs you're told to sing, and hope you land on the charts. If you were a woman, the sense of having to fit in became all the more pressing. You were expected to be pleasant, grateful, easy to work with, and never too outspoken. Yet from an early age, Gail showed signs of a more stubborn, exploratory spirit. She was the daughter of a father who'd been a musician himself, dabbling in everything from Western swing to bluesy tunes. One can only imagine the music that filled their home, maybe Hank Williams or Bob Wills drifting from a nearby record player, or her father's guitar strings humming away in the living room. Gail breathed in these sounds, letting them mingle with her own restless sense of curiosity. By her teenage years, the British invasion had swept the U.S. and rock and roll coexisted with country in a heady cultural mix. Nashville still retained an air of purism, but the younger generation was beginning to ask, why not try something new? It was in Los Angeles, ironically enough, that Gail Davies found some of her earliest breaks. She moved there at a young age. Some accounts say she was searching for a place where she could experiment without being pigeonholed. L.A. in the late 60s was a kaleidoscope of folk rock, psychedelic rock, Laurel Canyon singer-songwriters, and all kinds of cross-pollination. Musicians from every corner of the country arrived looking to jam, record, or simply break free from the more conservative mold found in other music capitals. For a young woman like Gail, L.A. was a laboratory of ideas. Here she began rubbing shoulders with session players and pickers who were themselves transplants. She absorbed their influences like a sponge, unafraid to blend country with softer rock elements or to experiment with chord progressions that were less typical in mainstream country. Her voice, while undeniably steeped in that classic country twang, had a warmth that lent itself well to more contemporary edges. She found session work, learning the behind-the-scenes mechanics of how records were actually made, how the board was set up, how producers shaped the final sound. That alone was unusual for a woman, especially one who aspired to be more than just a singer in the background. It wouldn't be entirely accurate to say Gail soared through the industry without stumbling. She faced the same pushback any woman in her position would have faced. Industry insiders might have told her, "Hey, you're a great singer, but let's have this guy handle production. Or, why not just sign with us? Let us pick the material and we'll take it from there. Countless women either succumbed to this line or left music altogether, frustrated by the lack of control. But Gail was resolute. She wanted to produce music as well as perform it. And she wasn't content to cede creative decisions just to keep the peace. In the mid to late 70s, after honing her chops on the West Coast, she decided to try her luck in the city that still claimed to be the heart of country music, Nashville. By this point, the Nashville sound had evolved, and the outlaw movement was in full swing, courtesy of icons like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. Meanwhile, Dolly Parton had begun bridging country and pop. Tammy Wynette was still a mainstay, and a slew of new female artists were forging their paths. The atmosphere was both permissive and restrictive, depending on whom you asked. There was a sense of possibility for women, but also lingering sexism from the establishment gatekeepers. Gail's big step came when she insisted on producing her own record. Now, to understand why that was such a big deal, imagine a large recording studio in Nashville, rows of instruments lining the walls, microphones set up like a small forest sprouting from the floor. Behind a glass window stands the control room, bristling with faders, knobs, and the quiet hum of tape machines. Typically, the person at the center of that control room, a man in a suit or maybe an older engineer with a gold watch, would be calling the shots. The artist, especially a female artist, might be asked for input, but ultimate decision-making power almost never rested in her hands. Yet Gail Davies dared to place herself on that other side of the glass, shaping not just her vocal performance, but also the instrumentation, the mix, the arrangement. She decided which song she'd record, how the steel guitar would interact with the fiddle, whether she'd incorporate a more rock-influenced drum pattern or stay traditional. Word around town was that some Nashville execs bristled at this. "Who does she think she is?" might have been a standard refrain. And yet after some initial friction, Gail found a label willing to let her take the wheel. That first self-produced album turned heads. It wasn't just about chart placement, though she did see radio success. It was the broader significance that a woman had done something so seldom done before. When the record dropped, country audiences took notice. Gail's music had that sweet, emotive storytelling tradition of classic country, but there was a polish that came from her LA sensibilities. Some folks described it as a pop flair, others a modern country aesthetic. Gail herself likely just thought of it as her music. She'd spent years refining it, forging a personal style. Critics praised her willingness to experiment with structure and arrangement, while more traditional voices in the industry sometimes grumbled that she was stepping too far from the norm. But Gail's resolve remained intact. She had achieved what she set out to do, produce an album by herself on her own terms, and let the world judge it on its own merits. From about 1978 to 1984, Gail's presence in country music soared. She notched hits, performed on the same stages as bigger names, and garnered a loyal fan base that appreciated her pioneering spirit. If you turned on the radio on a Saturday night, you might hear her voice drifting through your car. Some might have recognized it from the earlier days. Some might have heard talk about that female producer in Nashville. But no matter how they discovered her, the fact was that she was happening. She was influencing the next generation, young women who listened to her records and realized, wait, I could do that too. I don't have to just sing, I can call the shots. Yet every success story in the music business has its cost. As Gail climbed the ranks, she ran into the harsh reality of an industry that loved fresh faces but struggled to sustain them. For men, the pipeline of consistent support, radio airplay, and label loyalty seemed more stable. For women, it could be fickle. The moment you stepped out of line, criticized a major label, refuse to toe the line on your image, or push too hard for creative control, doors quietly began to close, even the ones that once seemed wide open. Around this time, the urban cowboy craze was in full tilt, fueled by the 1980 film featuring John Travolta. The pop country hybrid soared in commercial popularity, and labels scrambled for artists who fit that aesthetic. For some artists, it was a boon. For others, including Gail, it posed a question. Would you adapt your sound to chase the trend, or would you remain faithful to your artistic vision? Gail, with her background in self-production, likely had strong opinions. She wasn't one to simply jump on the bandwagon if it meant compromising her identity. The narrative that emerged was bittersweet. On the one hand, Gail was recognized by a core group of fans, by certain critics, and by younger female artists as a pioneer who'd broken the sonic ceiling for women. On the other hand, mainstream country, with its revolving door of chart toppers, rarely credited her for her trailblazing. It was as if the spotlight shone so brightly on the big male stars, who might have had more robust label backing, or simply more historical momentum, that Gail's achievements were overshadowed. She continued to produce, to write, to sing, but the widely circulated story of Nashville's evolution often left out the footnote about Gail Davies being the first female artist to produce her own records. It might sound discouraging, but Gail's spirit wasn't one to be easily extinguished. She had come this far by forging a path where none existed, and she pressed on. Even if the mainstream gatekeepers snubbed her or minimized her contributions, those who truly listened, who scoured the credits on album sleeves, who read the small print in magazines like Billboard or Country Music Magazine, they knew. They saw her name in the producer slot. They recognized her artistry. And crucially, the next wave of female producers, singer-songwriters, and boundary pushers took inspiration. The seed had been planted. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, for the music world to circle back and properly attribute credit to those who first dared to break the mold. Behind the scenes, Gail Davies' personal journey wasn't without heartbreak or disappointment. You can imagine the emotional toll. Each time she stepped into the studio, she'd be reminded that the system didn't quite know what to do with a woman who insisted on steering the ship. There might have been friction over budgets or tension about which session musicians to hire. She may have had to bargain for marketing support from labels that tended to throw their big budgets at the starriest male act of the moment. And then there was the intangible weight of an industry that sometimes tried to pit female artists against each other, as if there was only room for one or two at a time on the charts. From an outsider's perspective, the tragedy is that Gail's name isn't always included in the grand historical narrative of Nashville's transformation. She was overshadowed by massive figures and by the unstoppable churn of popular trends. By the time certain historians or critics decided to document the rise of female autonomy in country music, they often started with more famous artists or those who had bigger commercial breakthroughs. Gail became a footnote or an afterthought, even though her pioneering act of self-production was an undeniable milestone. Still, there's a poetic justice in how history has begun to circle back. In interviews, contemporary artists occasionally cite Gail Davies as an influence. Maybe they discovered her vinyl in a used record store or came across her story in an obscure corner of the internet. They realize that the path they walk, one where a woman can be a singer, songwriter, and producer with far less friction, is partially thanks to the quiet, determined fight Gail put up decades earlier. She didn't do it with grand, headline-grabbing gestures. She did it by simply insisting, "I will produce my own record," then doing it well. If you were to pick up a Gail Davies record from her heyday, you might be pleasantly surprised at how fresh it sounds even now. You'd hear a voice that glides effortlessly between classic and contemporary, supported by carefully layered instrumentation that's neither too pop nor too staunchly traditional. You'd detect the meticulous care that only a producer deeply invested in every note could bring. It's the sound of an artist in command, unafraid to thread influences together into a cohesive tapestry. And if you read the liner notes closely, you'd see, produced by Gail Davies. In a mid-1970s or early 1980s context, that alone is monumental. As for the personal dimension, we can only guess at the complex mix of pride and sadness that Gail Davies might feel when reflecting on her career. Pride, naturally, because she accomplished what was once deemed impossible for a woman in her field. Sadness, because recognition came late, and often in footnotes or niche retrospectives, rather than in the mainstream halls of fame she deserved. For the country music establishment, real change is often glacial, and the credit for that change can be slow to arrive. In the broader tapestry of country music history, Gail Davies stands as a vivid, if under-celebrated, testament to the power of resilience. If you trace the lineage of female country artists who demand creative control, think of names like Emmylou Harris, Rosanne Cash, Casey Musgraves, Brandi Carlile. Somewhere in that line, you'll find Gail Davies, forging the path so the next wave could walk it more confidently. It might not be spelled out in huge block letters, but the chain of inspiration is there. Because every time a woman in country steps into a studio and says, "Let's do it my way," she's in conversation with the women who dared to do so first. The heartbreak in Gail's story, though, is that her brand of rebellion didn't automatically translate into superstardom or universal acclaim. She became something of an unsung hero, applauded by the dedicated few, overshadowed by the loudest voices who conveniently took up all the oxygen in the conversation. When you consider that so many fans of modern country barely know her name, you can't help but feel a pang of frustration. Why doesn't every history of country music special highlight Gail Davies' significance? Why is it that her role as a trailblazer is often an afterthought, overshadowed by the glitz of more recognized stars? Perhaps that's how the industry operates. The male-driven narrative tends to highlight the men who ran the studios, produced the biggest hits, or achieved sensational commercial success. Women who carved out a unique path, who played a behind-the-scenes role, often got overlooked. And yet quietly, Gail's story has endured. The kind of thing that once existed only in the footnotes or in the recollection of a few dedicated fans is now inching closer to mainstream awareness, aided by the digital age. Younger musicians and fans can discover her discography with just a few keystrokes, unearth interviews and anecdotes that were once buried in physical archives and realize, wait, she did that? Why haven't I heard more about her? The too little, too late phenomenon in the music industry is hardly unique to Gail. The line between being revered and being forgotten can be heartbreakingly thin, and it often hinges on luck, timing, and whether the industry machine chooses to champion you. But if there's solace to be found, it's in the fact that the seeds Gail planted did take root. Each time a female country artist negotiates her contract with the clause stating she gets final say on the production, each time a young woman steps behind a console in Nashville determined to become a renowned producer, Gail's influence flickers. It might not have come with the spotlight or the industry award she deserved at the time, but the influence is there, quietly shaping the future. As you come to the end of Gail Davies' saga, you might feel a complex swirl of emotions: admiration for her courage, anger at the obstacles she faced, sorrow for the overshadowing of her achievements, and hope that modern audiences might rediscover her. You might imagine a future where her name is spoken in the same breath as the iconic male producers of her era, a future where female autonomy in country music is so normal that no one even bats an eye. That future may still be in the making, but Gail Davies' role in it is undeniable. So the next time you find yourself rolling down a highway with the windows open, scanning the radio for a tune that resonates, remember Gail Davies. Remember that behind the veneer of breezy twang and radio-friendly melodies lies a story of grit and passion, of a woman who refused to cede the mixing console simply because of her gender. And in that recollection, you pay a small tribute to the woman who broke the sound barrier in Nashville, as some might poetically put it. Her biography might be absent from many mainstream tributes. Her face might not grace the covers of the biggest magazines, but her impact reverberates in every chord that a modern female artist strums with total creative control. And in country music, a genre built on real human stories, what could be more authentic, more profoundly country than that?